problem with hatred and love it does not and cannot see. Reading Jane Austen begins with a cut, turns one back into a Freudian. First a dusting of snow, then a light rain, no minimal way to hide our disappointments. From ingrained tracks and tendencies, pattern, recognition, and wind-blown grass.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another exciting installment of our William Blake Live series. And today we have Kate Singer, who is Associate Professor of English at Mount Holyoke. She's author most recently of Romantic Vacancy, Gender, Affect, and Romantic Speculations. Her work's been published in Studying Romanticism, European Romantic Review. She has an amazing piece in the Journal of Interactive Technology and Pedagogy that I use. It's on TEI, like teaching TEI. I use it all the time. Yeah, she has a co-edited book. Is that Material Transgressions? Is that already out from Liverpool?
It should be out in July.
Okay, so that's cool. That sounds awesome. And so I wanted to get a sense of her work. And you know, her book is mostly about romantic women writers. She mentions Blake a little bit, but not a lot. However, so I wanted to quote something more generally that she brings up in that book, which I find to be really valuable in terms of connecting particularly deconstruction with new materialism. So she says this, she says, what have seemed to be deconstructive problems with language, history, materiality, and subjectivity turn out to be even larger problems about finding forms of movement like affect that are not generated by the sensing gendered body, but created by the playful turns of language itself. And so she very particularly does not associate Blake, I think, with vacancy, which is good. But like, I think some of these questions of like the connections between matter and language, I think, are very much in Blake's work too. So I think we'll see some of that play out today. So welcome, Kate. Why don't we just start with like your connection, or you know, did you read Blake just as a part of your own training in Romanticism, or was there another connection? Or
Yeah, actually, I think it was one of those things in grad school where I had like a buddy Joseph Byrne, who worked at Romantic Circles with me in grad school, and he was a big Blake person. And at one point, he's like, "I think I'm gonna do independent study on Blake. Do you want to do it with me?" And I was just like, okay. I didn't really know what I was getting into, but we ended up reading a lot of Blake, and we read Milton and Jerusalem. And so I think that experience was, I mean, obviously mind-blowing. And actually the first conference paper I ever did was on Blake. I went to Nassar with a paper on Beulah and sensibility and Blake's resistance to sensibility. So yeah, and then somehow I think because I was so interested in women writers, Blake kind of got sidelined.
Yeah.
And I think in the book, especially because Stephen Goldsmith's book, Blake's Agitation, dealt so roundly with Blake and affect, Blake kind of became like a footnote in that book. But I've become much more interested in him recently because I've been thinking a lot about shape-shifting. And so it seems like Blake is an important person to think that through with, and the way bodies are so important in Blake, but how fluid and how infinite they are. So I've like recently tried to come back to it, but I'm really more hoping that you all can kind of help me start to, you know, like re-enter the Blakean zone of, you know, infinite possibilities, because I haven't really been immersed in it very much. So very much until recently. So.
Yeah. Well, what made you, just more generally, what made you interested in Romanticism? Like, what brought you to Romanticism?
Oh, okay. Well, I think it was two things at once. So I actually started as an MFA. Well, I did get my MFA at University of Maryland, and we had to take some literature courses. And so my first grad school course was Intro to Literary Theory, which I hadn't had because my program in undergrad was very like new critical. And so I ended up taking literary theory with Oren Wong, which was definitely kind of I don't know, open the doors of perception, I guess, as you would say. But I got really into Damon and a little bit of Derrida through Oren because he's such a deconstructionist, and I think that it explains certain things about language that I felt like I had always been grappling with, that like nobody that I just hadn't heard explain that way. And so and then I think a semester later, my poetry teacher, Sam Plumley, basically like insisted that to finish the program, I had to take a romantic poetry class. And I had actually let's just say I had not done well in the romantic poetry class I had taken in college.
Oh.
And he basically like strong armed me into taking Neil Freistat's romanticism course. And I was definitely just transformed by that. Particularly, Neil asked one of the big questions Neil asked us in his like opening lecture was about women writers and whether or not they fit into the canon. And I was like, what is this all about? And then I would also say like reading Prometheus Unbound with Neil was kind of I don't know. There were certain just like key moments in that year that kind of roped me in, I guess.
It is really interesting how that connection through teachers kind of works, particularly with our own interactions with things like this. It's kind of fascinating. Cool. So you picked a plate from Visions of the Daughters of Albion, and so like it's so funny. I've read this poem a few times. I don't know it very well at all, and I think every scholar has their kind of blind spot, right? But I think it's been interesting to see, you know, particularly your interest in gender, and then also the conversation we had with Claire a couple of meetings ago, where she talked quite a bit about sort of the difficulty. And if I don't know if Claire's going to be able to hear us, but the difficulty that Blake had with sort of indistinctness in gender and sexuality, right? And so, you know, there's very much an importance placed upon sexual difference, and almost to the point where, like, you know, at one point we talked a bit about how Blake, you know, probably wouldn't know what to do with somebody who identified as like asexual or demisexual or non-binary. And so I found that to be really fascinating. So why did you pick Visions of the Daughters of Albion, and in particular this plate?
So allegedly, I think my new project, or the things I've been thinking about right now, have to do with shape shifting and ideas about ontological change. I mean, like I think like kind of pivoting from affect, which I think is kind of a material movement that moves through bodies and things, and kind of looking a little bit more broadly at ideas and movements of not just bodily change, but shapes and forms that shift. And so Blake seems to be like a place where this happens frequently. And I think so. Some of the discourses I've been thinking a lot about have been like queer and trans discourses, disability, and race, and how they kind of seem to come together in, right now in contemporary thought, but also in the Romantic period. So I think Visions of the Daughters of Albion, like, I was actually first thinking about the moment where Uthan like asks the eagle to come and like rend her body. And so I started reading through the visions again to think about gender, and about like different kinds of gender violence, but also other kinds of, metamorphosis. And I kind of landed on the plate with the flower. And I think somehow, it's like I think this is, for me, this is a text that I feel like I already know it. And so like when it's like, I feel like I could teach it, or like when I've taught it, it's like, okay, I feel like I already know what the gendered argument is. And so I feel like when I've read, I've always skipped from the argument, like right into the action of the rape. And I think when I was reading back through it, my brain caught on the moment where, um, Uthan is like thinking about plucking the flower, but she's also turning into the flower. And so I think, and I don't know how you all read Blake, but I feel like for me, there are different like moments that like kind of open up almost like a flower, and then they completely kind of um, change the way like I relate to the text as a whole. And so this was just one of those moments. And then I was also thinking about some plates from Jerusalem, and that are also have to do with women and kind of women being like put into the veil of nothingness and then brought out, and how there's a kind of, it's not just the inside outside thing that sometimes happens in Blake, but there's a whole kind of where there's not a like I'm closeted or shut in by my senses and then I'm like out into the infinite, but there's something that's like even more fluid that seems like it happens in Blake repeatedly, but also in rare moments in a text. And so I don't know, I just got stuck on this, and it also seems to be maybe, I think the last thing I'll say is this moment seems to come before all of the discursive kind of argumentation um, about, what has happened and what the rape means, and how various, male entities seem to be stuck in certain kinds of guilt and shame and like proprietary affect. But there, it seems like there's like this kind of feminine sexuality, or like a what Chen and Luciano call like a queer post-humanism that happens like in this very brief moment at the beginning of the text and then kind of gets closed down. And so I was kind of interested in what Blake was doing with that moment of possibility, before it gets like shuffled through all of this, discursive morass of masculine, like, colonial masculinity.
Yeah, that's totally amazing. I had so many thoughts about this question of maiming. um I just started reading Jasbir Puar's Right to Maim,
Yeah,
which is kind of
I have too, actually.
bringing stuff like this up, this question of like what does it mean to circumscribe a kind of, I just got through with her whole reading of the uh It Gets Better campaign, right? Like in the whole notion of like this kind of normative gay Dan Savage person saying like, if you just, keep working and don't die, that it'll finally get better, and that there's all sorts of like subjectivities that are sacrificed in that kind of moment, right? In order to create that campaign, and all sorts of like racialized, just bodies, racialized gay bodies, racialized bodies that are debilitated and stuff like that. And so I think it's really interesting to kind of think about what are the possibilities of this type of body, but then like also like how does the text negotiate closing down or opening up different sites of possibility, right? And so um I would like to read that plate if that's possible. Would you like to do it?
Sure.
Okay.
um Let me just get back to it.
All right.
Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
Visions. Enslaved, the daughters of Albion weep, a trembling lamentation upon their mountains and their valleys, sighs towards America. For the soft soul of America, Uthan wandered in woe along the vales of Lutha, seeking flowers to comfort her. And thus she spoke to the bright marigold of Lutha's vale. Art thou a flower? Art thou a nymph? I see thee now a flower, now a nymph. I dare not pluck thee from thy dewy bed. Mild the golden nymph replied, pluck thou my flower, Uthon. Another flower shall spring. Because the soul of sweet delight can never pass away, she ceased and closed her golden shrine. Then Uthon picked the flower, saying, I pluck thee from thy bed, sweet flower, and put thee here to glow between my breasts, and thus I turn my face to where my whole soul seeks. Over the waves she went in winged exultation, swift delight, and over Theotormund's reign took her impetuous course. Bromion rent her with his thunders, on his stormy bed lay thy faint maid, and soon her woes appalled his thunder's horse. Bromion spoke, behold this harlot here on Bromion's bed. And let the jealous dolphins sport around the lovely maid. Thy soft American plains are mine, and mine thy north and south. Stamped with my signet are the swarthy children of the sun. They are obedient, they resist not, they obey the scourge. Their daughters worship terrors and obey the violent.
Ah, what a switch. It's such a switch, right? The beginning is so like la-di-da, and then suddenly, you know, the hammer comes down. Or like just this terror and this destruction. And so in terms of like, you wanted to talk particularly about the flower and the nymph section. Like, what were some things that, you know, came out in that section for you?
Well, I think that I think two things. One is that there's already weeping and sighing toward America. So we kind of already have that. We already have that lamentatory context. So there's already a kind of, well, so that's kind of the frame here. And then and the plate is called Visions too, right? So if the lamentation is happening about America, the sighs are moving toward America, and yet then you have this vision that's kind of indented into that enslaved frame, right? And the vision or the disruption of the enslavement has to do with this ontological question: Are thou a flower? Are thou a nymph? And I think for me, that question reflects back on Uthon herself. Like, what is she? And also, you know, Blake's whole mythological aqueousness. I think there's always this question of, you know, what is the ontological status of any given entity or body, and how are they relating to other entities or bodies? But this question too, so then you think about, okay, now, like, I see thee now a flower, now a nymph, I dare not pluck thee from thy dewy bed, right? So there is, I feel like, the classic reading of the kind of virginal flower, you know, who becomes a nymph, right? Or becomes sexualized by the act of plucking. And so I think then I was thirdly interested in what happens in that next kind of indented stanza, where or I guess maybe not that stanza, but afterwards, where Uthon plucks the flower, right? So there is this validation of some sort of feminine sexuality, right? Because the soul of sweet delight can never pass away. But then there is this: I pluck thee from thy bed, sweet flower, and put thee here to glow between my breasts, and thus I turn my face to where my whole soul seeks. So I think it's easy to read that, okay, she accepts the idea of, you know, plucking the flower doesn't mean she's no longer like virginal, or that there's some like that there's some sort of validation for some sort of desire that has to do with the seeking of the soul, right? And then she's like moving towards Theotorman, except she gets interrupted by Bromian, right? And then there's this whole question of like, is she going to be slut shamed, or how are we going to view her sexuality like in the wake of the sexual violence that happens. But I think I was interested in and put thee here to glow between my breasts, right? So there is this human non-human kind of assemblage that's happening, that seems to be something like maybe ontologically different than what happens after, that the flower is not dead, but the flower is glowing, and that she and the flower are kind of involved in some sort of, I don't know, journey, that is in some ways completely out of the context, or kind of comes before the insertion of male desire.
Yeah, it's really interesting. A lot of what you said is really fascinating in terms of the assemblage and this sense of there's like a sexual kind of plenitude in the beginning, it seems, right? The sense that like, being plucked does not mean that you're no longer a virgin, right? Like on some level, right? Like you can have like virginity, it seems, and sexuality if you want. Like you can have it all. Like there's not a kind of like there's a kind of just a playfulness about it. But I find it interesting that you talk about like, yeah, definitely there's a weeping that begins, and it begins with enslavement, right? Enslave the daughters of Albion weep. And I'm also curious, and I think anyone in the room or Kate could answer this, definitely, like vision, the fact that visions is at the top of this is really weird to me. It's really weird. Like, I don't know, it seems like, okay, so maybe a regular reading of it would be like, I'm having a vision and here's the vision, right? Or this character's having a vision and here's the vision. But it's not, it seems like the visions are of the daughters of Albion, but it's more than one vision, right? And who are the daughters of Albion at this moment?
Well, I was also thinking about that part of the ontological question is, she says, art thou a flower, art thou a nymph?
Yeah.
That she's in a sense having a double vision of human, non-human ontology, or what we might call post-human ontology, or what I might call a kind of not like, that she's starting to enter a kind of non-binary space, both of sexuality and of ontology, and that they actually work in tandem, and that the frame it, so those are the visions, but there's a lamentation of the enslaved that kind of frames that, and those are human woes, or those are the woes of America, which we find, at least when Bromian speaks them, it's about a colonial binary of human and dehumanization,
right?
Or like sin and pleasure, or not sin and pleasure, but you have the harlot and the lovely maid. But I mean, I think I was struck when Bromian describes, thy soft American plains are mine, and mine thy north and south. There you have like the propertied inscription of the landscape with the signet. And that's like a very definitive, I mean, I don't even know if we would call it a vision, but it's like a stamped picture, right? Just like the chartered streets of London. And then they are obedient, they resist not. That, like, there's kind of like they're like both human and dehumanized, but up above we have something that that is like a little bit more visionary in its like non-humanness.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting too is like, so like in there, Blake has this whole idea that like the chartered streets are in a way a vision. They're just a shitty vision. Like they're kind of the vision of the state, right? The state, like I'm thinking like Benedict Anderson's notion of national, right? The nation state is the imaginary, right? Like that it's kind of like this kind of, or the symbolic, like it's like this kind of like, it's its own kind of visionary experience, right? In Marriage of Heaven and Hell, it's the angel who's like having the fantasy of hell, whereas like once the angel leaves, Blake is kind of like, suddenly everything's okay because I'm not having to deal with your crap anymore, right? And so I think in some ways, yeah, Bromian definitely is like kind of imposing that upon America in that moment. It's really fascinating. And I think it's also really fascinating too, like this question of like, you know, America itself is a kind of utopian space that has failed in a way, right? Like that's failed in the very beginning of this poem. But like in this question of like ontological kind of this ontological doubleness, right? Um, I wonder how Blake, I mean, certainly it's not the violence of Bromian, but I wonder how Blake kind of characterizes that indistinctness, right? Like is that a source of kind of pleasure for him? Is that like a um right? Like, or is it something else?
I mean, I think it might be interesting to talk about the visuality of the plate or the engravings
Sure.
here. I mean, especially the whatever is happening at the bottom of the plate. I mean, we have the kind of fibrous, like sinews, and like the curlicues. And when I taught Blake this semester, my students were like really obsessed with those those sinews being like a moment of non-binary like fluidity
Mm.
that especially where like um and maybe not as much on this plate, but some others where, you know, you almost can't, like the words become very difficult. They become much less legible
Yeah.
thanks to the like the curly cues.
Mhm.
But I mean, I think the figurality of what's happening below, and it may be just the copy I'm looking at, but I feel like the bodies and the landscape are kind of um you know, especially the figure on the right, it's like that's a body, but it seems like it could be some sort of rock formation.
Mhm.
Um, and the way that the outlining is kind of becoming similar, but then there are moments where you have the like muscly, like like you know, Grecian form, but then it kind of seems to fade into the landscape. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, I think that there are moments where like I feel like with this ontological fluidity that it happens more through the watercoloring and through the figurality or the like resistance, like the invocation of Greek, um the Greek body, and then the kind of seeming like disintegration or fluidity of that into the landscape.
Yeah.
um, that it happens like even more emphatically sometimes there than it does in the language itself.
It's reminding me quite a bit what you're saying of the Book of Urizen, right? Where bodies are constantly becoming other things. And it's so fascinating. I have not, so like with Blake, one of the things I always struggle with, I still struggle with it, is his obsession with the bounding line and talking about, you know, as a printer, like one of the things he always was obsessed with was like creating a very intentional a very dark bounding line, right? And he always talks about the need to do that, and that all great art is about that. And yet he has these moments, especially in his earlier poems, even like in his later poems, definitely, but like of this kind of ontological flow that's kind of that kind of bleeds out of these forms, right? That like where there is a kind of indistinctness. And I am not always aware I don't always know what to do with those moments, because those are the moments that are really interesting to me in Blake, and yet it seems like he struggles very much with his own attitude towards it in some ways. Anyone else have any thoughts about this? I think this is an interesting moment.
Oh, I have an idea. Can I say it?
I thought,
All right, well, I love this. I love visions. I'm glad you picked it, Kate, because this is like where I really start with the myth. And uh, that Luther with the flower, she sees simultaneously a nymph and a flower. And those are two modes of perception, you know, physical and material, and spiritual, so to speak, the way Blake might say it. But she's seeing both at once. And I think that's uh, who she is. That's a reflection on her. And I think when she clings that flower to her, it doesn't die. That's interesting. So it's not purely a material thing, and it glows, and she's embracing both. Um, and then I think, you know, she's a representative of the soft soul of America. She's what America's supposed to be. And Bromion introduces slavery to the narrative. So what I think is going on is you know, Blake has an ideal vision of America represented by Uthun that embraces both spiritual and material vision, and then slavery is imposed on that by force. You know, they're swarthy children of the sun. I mean, it's a reference to slavery of Africans in the United States. So Bromion's rape of Uthun is like a, a narrative representation of what the institution of slavery does to the United States. Okay, so that's reading it one way. I mean, that's reading the politics, the gender as a commentary on politics. But I think it can read the other way too. What it can be read the other way. What slavery can be read as an analog to what men are doing to women too. And you know, Uthun is that ideal that's being violated either way. So that's been my reading of the text. And I think the transformations that you see, they're perceptions. They're simultaneous perceptions of two things that are always true at all times. And Uthun sees it, but no one else does. So that's my reading, anyways.
Yeah, Rebecca.
I just wanted to add to the second reading of that I mean, that's very much in keeping with the way that the kind of problematic way that Mary Wollstonecraft approaches what she sees as the relationship between slavery and thinking about women as, you know, as she puts it, female creatures. And of course, we know about that you know, they were part of the network, so that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Yeah, Wollstonecraft and Fuseli and Blake, and it's interesting.
Pain.
Yeah. So like, I was really taken with, I mean, I was thinking of like both like two, I think this is only like twofold vision, not necessarily fourfold vision, right? That's really going on here in a way. But I was also, Claire says that pre-slavery ideal of America and the tabula rasa is still a dream of new world colonization. Yeah, totally. Like the idea that America is itself kind of this, not only kind of this utopia, but kind of the Eden, right? Like, which is something from Milton. Um, and then a certain ideal of woman also, right? Like, and so the other side of it is like this, yeah, like this sort of purity aspect to it that it begins with, which is really interesting. Rebecca.
Yeah, but I mean, then you go back to many of these people reading William Robertson and other descriptions of the land de Negra, in in South America, and then you don't have any the history of colonization in the Americas, and the history of slavery begins in the same place in those narratives. So
Could you explain that a little more? Could you go into that a little more?
like William Robertson's history of America, which is of course continental rather than of the United States, which involves itself in this myth. Well, I mean, it's not really a myth because it really happened, but the story of Spanish colonization, Portuguese colonization of the New World in ways that involve slavery, whether that is of indigenous people or of people brought from Africa, pretty much from the very beginning. And that therefore any kind of idea of utopian America that is somehow before slavery is very difficult, and Blake knows that because this was a prominent book. I'm thinking about the way that Southey used material from that book in his what he's written about Brazil and so on. His this later in this text, but text on Aguirre and the expedition of Aguirre and Ursula.
So what do we do with like, and I think that's really interesting. I think Kate's question on the chat is really fascinating too, right? Like, so what do we do with having both of those things at the same time, where it's kind of like this ontological moment, kind of fascinating moment, right? But then also this sort of always already, right? Space of, because I mean, I got the sense that Blake did sort of buy into this kind of purity notion of America, even though, I mean, maybe not right here, right? But I'm reading that kind of like, this is a sequel to his disillusionments or something, like, and he's like kind of dealing with it at the beginning or something. But I mean, I think he definitely had this kind of sense that America was kind of this, not only this potentially utopian space, but also this kind of like virginal space.
But isn't part of what's trying, isn't what, I mean, I agree he's struggling with it, but I think he's trying to get out of the binary of virginal, non-virginal.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I feel like this moment is much more fraught, and maybe, queer itself, and whatever's happening between human, non-human, and Luthan and Lutha, that they're not, and that it's not a before or after slavery, because slavery is always already there. I mean, like, it starts with like the whole plate starts with this big enslaved, right? But there's almost this like kind of it's like a moment of queer temporality. It seems like there's kind of this moment, this like moment of suspension, right? Or this disruption.
Yeah. So I think Thora's comment really helps a bit with that line of thinking, Kate, in a sense, because like, yeah, I'm reminded too of Urizen, the book of Urizen, where it's like, what happened? When was the pre-fallen state? But that pre-fallen state is like really fraught in that poem. Like, we can't tell, if there ever was a beginning, if that beginning is endlessly being deferred by Urizen, who's actually creating time and space in the process of, right, abstracting, and like, who's doing the abstraction. I mean, because there is no Urizen before the abstraction. Like, so Blake is constantly sort of complicating those temporal moments as well. Yeah, it's really interesting.
So, can I ask a question of something Kate was saying that I think I just wanted to maybe hear a little bit more about a little bit. It seems like one of the things you're saying is that uh, Blake is going past uh, these kind of binaristic states of being, right? And one way that happens is through this kind of queering between you and non-human. And I'm just wondering if you say a little bit more about how the shape shifting plays in here in terms of getting beyond that kind of binaristic thinking.
Well, I don't know if he does get beyond it because the rest of the poem seems to be really struggling with the possibility of whether that, or the impossibility of that, given, you know, given the entire frame of slavery or, you know, brokenness. But I think, I mean, I think that the queering and the non-humanness are like a form of, I don't know if you would call it like positive othering, but it's kind of a resistance to normativity that isn't just about the resistance to normativity.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So I think that he's trying to imagine something that's outside of like heteronormativity and outside of reproductive futurism, that is about, like in Blake, some sort of pleasure, but pleasure that isn't about domination. And I think that's one of the one of the things about the multiplicity of this moment. That, yeah, it's about perception, but it's also about being. At the same time, there is like the queering is a kind of sameness where there isn't a kind of domination necessarily that's happening even in the plucking, maybe. And that there's this moment where something else is possible, but then that is really quickly foreclosed upon.
I see. Okay, thanks. No, that makes sense. I'm a very Blake novice, so.
What happens to the flower? Where does the flower go? Like, does the flower just stay there for the rest of the poem, or do we know?
I don't know. It kind of seems like to disappear.
It's lost, Jim? Like, or it just disappears? Yeah. Yeah, so that's interesting. Like, that is interesting too. As y'all were talking, I was really trying to come up with the way, you know, some people talk about the difficulty of Blake's various notions of redemption. I think they're often really difficult to even unpack what it means, or what Blake is looking for. I think it becomes more clear somewhat in Jerusalem, but certainly in these earlier poems, it doesn't feel like there is much beyond, like, once slavery or once there's a kind of chaining down. You know, I'm thinking of Urizen literally becoming the earth, and that, you know, in some ways it's not just our minds in Urizen, it's not just our imagination, but it's materially our bodies that become these spaces of oppression, right? And I think that, you know, that's sort of like understanding what it means to get out of this is really interesting too. And certainly, like, I think that goes along with these questions of colonialism and slavery, that once countries sort of engage in it, and make their economies sort of totally subservient to these processes of domination, it becomes hard to know what to do with that. beyond the fact that it's there. I don't know. I mean, certainly we know obviously that Blake was part of the abolition movement and stuff like that, but So Thora asks, Kate, can you connect the plucking of the flower to the binding of the oppressor, enslaver, Bromion to Uthun? I haven't thought that through yet, but it might be productive.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can answer that yet. I mean, I was thinking about the maiming that happens and what Roger was saying, in terms of like when Uthun, sorry, I always pronounce her name wrong, Uthun, basically asks for her body to be tattooed, and how it's both like a mark of injustice, but also it is that like bodily pain that she's kind of taking on, and that maiming becomes kind of irrevocable in a certain way, and this question of like how do you get out of that. And I feel like that reminds me of Beulah, and some of Blake's later portrayals of Beulah, that like when you get stuck in Beulah, it's like, well, you're just like weighed down by this like materiality that is much less fluid. I don't know. I think Tora's question reminds me of Prometheus and Bound too. This idea of like what happens when you chain the oppressor, and like what is the, like how is that a similar movement to the idea of plucking, right? And all these moments of like asymmetrical violence or reactive violence versus some sort of transformative justice moment.
That reminds me very much of the Chenchi too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had a thought. It reminded me of something else, but now I lost it. Yeah, I lost it totally.
So is Prometheus Unbound able to do some of the things this poem is not able to do in terms of moving beyond that type of logic that you're talking about, that type of ontological logic of reproductive futurism that he's trying to get past here, but you said earlier you think he struggles to completely do that. So in that different vision of the enslaved or bound in Prometheus, is that in your current work that you're doing, is something that kind of thinks differently or more fully through these issues than Blake can do here?
I don't know. I mean, I think I would say there might be a different emphasis. Like I think Blake in a certain sense, I don't know, maybe he's more like the psychiatrist's client or something, and Prometheus is more of like, I don't know, something else. But in other words, like I feel like Blake gets caught in the symptom a little bit because he's really interested. I mean, so much of this poem is about Theotormon and Bromion kind of telling what the problem is, and Bromion has some really interesting, I think Bromion has some interesting kind of discussions about why he's doing what he's doing. But I guess what I want to say is like Blake is really dwelling in the kind of psychodynamics of the symptom or the problem, whereas I think Shelley kind of often has these like deus ex machina moments where it's like, and things are transformed, right? And then we get to like, and Shelley is really interested in like, how do we get to the like queer non-human moment again, right? So I feel like I guess I want to say they seem like inverses of each other. Like here we have this moment of possibility that then is closed down on, and then Blake's like, well, what, like, why do we keep getting stuck in these systems? You know, like what is it about the systems that are so oppressive? Like, how do they work? What are the stories we tell ourselves, or what are the like justifications that we use in all sorts of metaphorical registers that cement them in place? And I mean, Prometheus, we have like, basically we have act one where there's like Prometheus struggling, and then he kind of throws off like, oh, well, like I need to like not, you know, replicate what the master is doing, and he throws it off. And then the rest of that play is really all about transformation, and there are multiple transformations that happen, and Shelley wants to envision like, how does that transformation happen, what does it look like, right? So I think it's just, and also I'm just taking these two things like separately, but they seem like flip sides of the same thing in certain ways.
I think Blake is fascinated with, I think, did you use the word machinery? Because that's a very Blakean term. But I think he's very interested in the machinery of oppression, like the machinery of it. Like he gets really almost like a visionary gets wrapped up in something and is fascinated by the detail of it, right? He just stares at it forever. And like to the point where it seems like you can't get out of it, right? And I think Shelley, and I don't know, like I was thinking as you were talking about the difference between the two poems, like is Shelley more of an optimist politically than Blake? You know, like, and how do we think about that? I know, you know, there's a lot of scholarship on the idea that especially the first generation romantics had this, I mean, it's an old argument that they were looking at the French Revolution and seeing what was happening and being like, you know, especially Wordsworth, but I think there's some of that in Blake too.
With Shelley, is it worth saying at what point and in what relation to Peterloo?
Yeah.
Evie, were you trying to say something before?
I was muted, I'm sorry. This is such a great discussion. For some reason, I had it in my mind and I muted myself. I rushed over to my bookcase and picked up Ginsberg's Fall of America. And I was really struck by the similarities, the way in the machinery that that Roger was talking about, and the double vision is completely there. It is both a kind of love affair and a condemnation, and you don't know at one moment which is which. And this is something I really value in Blake. I'm coming to really value in Blake, and I think you're really catching it here on this plate. And I just wanted to say that that was the association that I made, and just sort of share it in terms of what kind of politics that is, you know.
I keep getting struck. I don't know how much you've read David Balch's work, but like he really gets into this too, and like it's really fascinating. He does a lot of Deleuzian readings, and sometimes I read it and so his big argument right now is that he's trying to argue that, like, you know, Blake never got, like, he was always a political, right, poet, like, and like, even if you, I mean, the main argument is like he starts out as more political and then gets kind of less political and more imaginary, right? But I think David's trying to say, no, it's just that the stakes are shifting for Blake. And I think that's true. I think that's true. But I also, like, whenever he keeps, you know, I think one of the things that David always brings up is like, well, it's really about like the production of something new. Like, this is a phrase that he keeps repeating in his scholarship, and he says, like, all of this stuff is about getting ready for the production of something new. And I find that to be kind of like a letdown when I finish his pieces, where I'm kind of like, okay, good for that, good, there's something new coming that is going to be maybe liberatory, but who knows? But it seems very vague and like, and I think that that's the case in Blitz's later work, and generally speaking, that it's like he is like, I don't know if it's, yeah, I think he condemns stuff, but I don't, is he a cynic? I don't know. Like, I don't know if it gets to that, but there's a certain way in which the sort of, it just seems much more muddled with Blake. Oh, I think I think he attempts to achieve in Jerusalem what Shelley achieves in Prometheus Unbound, but Visions is a long way off from that, as James said, and Kate agrees.
What's the distinction? What's the political prophetic thing there that you're talking about?
Me?
David.
Yeah.
I think I'm thinking about the way in which there are these temporal structures, these temporal structures, and these kinds of constant and detemporalizations happening, and new possibilities constantly. So when Roger was talking about production, I was thinking about that, and I was thinking that there are two kinds of production in Blake, right? There's this one kind of production that's completely stifling, and another kind of production which is completely liberatory. Mm-hmm. And this other kind of production, I think that you can't kind of have one without the other, it seems, in Blake's world. And so it's about kind of this constant production of something that is never completely new, but is different. It's a kind of shifting, and it's an overlaying, and it's never single. It's always multiple, which is why I like Kate's reading so much. That it's kind of like, it's why you can't make sense of the allegories completely to me, because there's always this doubleness. That's what I meant, Chris. That's probably a bad answer, but that's what I meant.
No.
What you're saying, David, reminds me of Sari Makdizi's work where he talks about liberal temporal progressivism, right? This kind of sense. And I think sometimes when we use words the political, it becomes very easy to read it in that way, right? Like there's a kind of social progress that is natural, that goes with our attempts to make things more free, and that Blake is utterly uninterested in that.
Right. And I think that's why I was trying to shift it over to the prophetic or something like that.
Yeah. But I think for him, I'm thinking also of the moment that Satan's watch fiends can't find, right? Like, so like this idea that he's so wrapped up in the emergence of industrial time and the industrial mill and the industrial revolution and the need to produce commodities and he's feeling that, and he's so obsessed with that he, whenever he's talking about time, it's kind of, as Kate mentioned early in the discussion, it's an unfolding, right? It's a kind of opening, an englobing or an unglobing. Yeah. Well, this has been awesome. Does anyone else have a final thought? Or Kate, do you have a final thought or to go with this? This has been a really interesting moment in time.
No, I'm excited to, I think some other people are going to be thinking about Jerusalem. So yeah. I'm interested to be thinking about some of these same questions.
Right.
When we return to Jerusalem, I think that's where my brain goes next.
Yeah, I think that's great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Kate, for this discussion, and thanks everyone for just an amazing, it's like one of those moments in English classes. There are two great English classes. One, from my perspective, probably more, obviously, but One is like when people can't stop talking, and the other is like when people are just kind of in this like meditative and kind of moment together, and like it's punctuated by these little statements that then keeps it going, and you feel like you're all trancing together. So this was totally amazing, and I will see y'all later, and I hope to see you next week for another great William Blake Live discussion. All right.
Thanks,
Thank
Roger.
you.
It was
Thank
fun to
you.
see everybody.
Thank you, Kate.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks so much.
you. Good to see you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Roger.
Thank you so much, Kate.
Yeah, thanks, Roger.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, I'll make it to the next one, I hope.
Sure. Have a good one.
You too.
This is the problem with hatred and love. It does not and cannot see. Reading Jane Austen begins with a cut, turns one back into a Freudian. First a dusting of snow, then a light rain, no minimal way to hide our disappointment.